We have a small select gathering today. I hope some people may come late, let's see, but let's make a start. Okay, today for 2 hours and then for 1 hour on, or 50 minutes I should say, on Tuesday, we will look at, well, primarily the political developments in the British Isles, Britain and Ireland, from somewhere second half of the 9th century, the 10th century, and into the 11th century. And we shall pick up the story, the following topic, when we look at the Normans and so on, for the later part of the 11th century. There are a number of themes, a number of very broad developments which allow us to make some kind of generalization about what's going on in Britain and Ireland, especially in Britain, I suppose, during this period. One of them is to some extent the gradual consolidation of political power in parts of Britain. So in the earlier period, as we've been looking for the past few weeks, prior to the arrival of the Vikings, we had a situation which, obviously back around about 700 on this map, indicates that although we're dealing with a very small place, we've got lots and lots of kingdoms and so on. Some of them obviously more powerful than others. Some of these kingdoms, I know the Magensite here in the West Midlands, disappearing, but primarily we have a fairly significant degree of political fragmentation. And in the case of Ireland, on this map, they've just shown us the main provinces, the main fifths. And as you remember, below that level, we have lots of smaller kingdoms and dynasties down to quite a low level as well. So political fragmentation significant there as well. And we've been looking at the development of this process following the end of the Roman Empire. By about 900, however, I don't know how great that picture is. Maybe we can put a slightly bigger but less focused one up here, and we can. Oh no, this is not acetate, is it? So we got to put this one back, and maybe we can put this one up here as a kind of replacement. By say 900, as we were discussing on this time last week and on Tuesday this week, we see a significant change, especially in Britain, less so in Ireland, but especially in Britain, a significant change in the political structures, primarily due to the Vikings. Okay, so as we discussed, and we'll talk a little bit more about it today, we have the emergence of this kind of boundary in England between the area ruled by Alfred the Great and his immediate successors, and then in the north we have a very different situation. In the east we have these Viking settled areas up here. Okay, we have something going on in Northumbria, it's quite dark. Scotland, okay, we have the final years of the kingdom of Strathclyde. We may have some kind of Viking situation, small kingdom or something emerging here. We have the new kingdom of the Scots, we'll talk about that, but initially we've got the kings of the Scots and the Picts still. And then we've got some kind of Viking situation, an earldom being set up in the Orkneys, and then the Isle of Man and the Western Islands as well, forming a separate thing. So a big change. All the kingdoms that we'd previously been seeing, Mercia and all the others, disappearing. What we'll see is, for England, the gradual spread of the political and military power of the West Saxons northwards, okay, during the 10th century, and by the middle of the 10th century, more or less establishing what they will call the kingdom of the English, of England, in that period. So that's an example of what we could regard as consolidation. We see the creation of the kingdom of the Scots in Scotland. We see the emergence in Wales of a new dynasty, setting up power, but breaking up into little groups, but setting up power for its members in a large part of Wales. And then, significantly in Ireland, we see the growth of the power of certain kings, some of the kings in Meath and then later on, particularly ruler from the Dal Cash in Munster, and we've talked about that before, Brian Boru. Okay, big names, big power, taking over larger areas, at least for a while, and so on. So that's one theme. A sort of movement away from political fragmentation to consolidation, in some cases leading to new kinds of fragmentation, okay? Part of this process breaking up into new patterns and things like that. In addition, as I've just said, we see also new dynasties, new ruling families emerging. In Wales, as Burchin will be telling us on Tuesday in her presentation, but we'll talk a bit about these people today as well, we have a new dynasty, sometimes associated with its earliest, most powerful member, called Rhodri Mawr, which means Rhodri the Big or Rhodri the Great or something, okay? And he, Zainab, are you reading another book or are you listening? I mean, right, okay. And he emerges somewhere in the north and then spreads his power and his family's power elsewhere. But where he comes from is a matter of some debate. Some people suggest his family came from the Isle of Man. That may or may not be true. But he's not a direct member of the existing family. He married into the existing rulers in the north of Gwynedd, okay, using a marital connection to spread his power. That's one case. In Scotland, a guy called Kenneth MacAlpine, Kinnaird MacAlpine, he also emerges from the existing Dalriaton family, the guys that were originally based here. Okay, he's one of the he's one of the members of that family, but he's not of a main branch of that family, so he's able to assert his power over his relatives as well. So here are two new dynasties emerging. Anyone know what Mac means? Anyone know? Mac? Son, okay. And if you've had time to read those Welsh genealogies, which I gave you, and we'll come back to those, you'll see the word map there. Okay, remember our P and Q Celtic, okay? It's the same word for son, but in the different languages and so on. And in Ireland, we see Brian Boruma as the most famous representative of a new dynasty establishing itself, okay, and claiming power over Munster and so on. In addition, as I shall say again later, we could even see Alfred the Great as a kind of new dynasty. Although he was descended from the previous kings of the West Saxons, although Alfred was descended from the earlier kings of the kingdom of the West Saxons, the fact that his successors extend their power beyond Wessex northwards means that in effect they're creating a new dynasty. Okay, they are asserting their power beyond where they had it before. So we don't usually think of Alfred the Great or Edward the Elder or Athelstan as kind of newcomers, but in a sense that's effectively what they were doing, and doing something new. So in all areas we see political consolidation to some extent. We see new political families emerging in one way or another, asserting themselves. Perhaps at least partly because of the Viking threats, okay? The disruption caused by the Viking raids and then the Viking settlements, the coloured areas on these dark coloured areas on these maps, okay, undermining the old kingdoms, undermining the old kings, and perhaps creating a power vacuum to some extent. Power vacuum meaning an empty space or a not so full space in which new guys can step in. So these kind of people represent these new guys in a way. These people are faced with a problem because traditionally Kings like to see themselves as somehow legitimate. Not in the sense of illegitimate birth or something, though these things are connected, but legitimate politically in terms of why they have power. They can justify the fact that they are the king because of usually birth. Okay, my father, or at least some other members of my family, had been king, so by a certain logic, which we don't believe so much today, but we do up to a point, I should be king as well. Okay, but these people, in various ways, were not actually directly descended from previous kings. They may be related to kings very distantly or perhaps not at all. And so they had a problem of legitimacy and succession. And they were aware of this. They were great fighters, they were great rulers and leaders, so they established themselves through their political power. But how did they justify and explain their power in terms of legal legitimacy? So, to use the kind of pseudo-Latin phrases, these people became king often de facto, but there's a question mark next to whether they were legitimately king de jure. Okay? They were king in fact, because they effectively ruled these places, but were they king by law, legally speaking? We see at least the family of Rhodri Mawr in Wales trying to legitimise themselves by claiming to be descended from previous rulers and also to claiming to be married to some of the other families. And we may discuss this on Tuesday as part of Burçin's presentation. Okay, is that all clear? So those are my kind of four trends in a sense. We see some degree of political change involving bigger structures, bigger power, with a little bit of fragmentation if you want, okay? We see the emergence of new dynasties. These dynasties had, to some extent, legitimacy problems, and then we have to remember that, to some extent, these changes may have been partly affected by the behavior and actions of the Vikings in their attacks, but also in their settlements and political takeover in different parts of Britain. Okay, now let's move specifically to England, and okay, we can keep that map, and I shall see if we can find some things to look at here. Okay, that should be fairly clear. Right. And here we have Alfred. So for looking at England, our starting point is the figure of Alfred the Great, here represented by obviously a later statue. This wasn't a contemporary one, we don't know exactly what he looked like. He was king of the West Saxons, Wessex as we can call it, from 871 to right to the end of the 9th century, 899, as I may have mentioned before. Okay. He's known as the Great for various reasons, but most significantly because, as we said, he was the main English ruler who succeeded, just about, but he succeeded, in defeating the Vikings and preventing his kingdom from being destroyed. Whereas we've seen Northumbria, Wessex, East Anglia more or less disappearing under the pressure of the Vikings, Alfred almost loses but comes back. I won't go into the details, the stories are great sort of romantic stories and so on, but he succeeds in coming militarily against the Vikings and then coming to terms with them. And we see 878, 879, he establishes this peace with the Viking leader Guthrum. In fact, we have a kind of text of his treaty, whatever we want to call it here, and what they effectively set up at this point, and then later on in the second treaty is this Danelaw border that we mentioned before. This is the peace that King Alfred and King Guthrum and the Witan, which means the kind of council of all the English nation, okay, which is a bit of an exaggeration, I suspect, and all the people that are in East Anglia have all ordained and with oaths confirmed for themselves and for their descendants, as well for born as unborn, who reck of God's mercy or of ours. Concerning our land boundaries, up on the Thames, the big river that runs through London and so on, then up on the Lee and along the Lee unto its source, and then straight to Bedford, and then onto the Ouse, onto Watling Street. So they're establishing the border here according to rivers, which is a reasonable thing to do in the Middle Ages. Then is this: if a man be slain, we estimate all equally dear, English and Danish, at 8 half marks of pure gold, except the ceorl, who is a kind of peasant man, who resides on rented land, and the Danes' freedmen. They are also equally dear, either at 200 shillings. And if a king's thane be accused of manslaying, and if he dare clear himself on oath, let him do that with 12 king's thanes. Okay, so if there's an accusation of murder, he can get promises from other people. If anyone accuse that man who is of less degree than the king's thane, let him clear himself with 11 of his equals, and then one of the king's thane. A thane is a kind of nobleman, a warrior, and so on. This is the bit here, okay? And we all ordained on that day that the oaths were sworn, that neither bond nor free, that's a servant nor free man, might go to the host without leave, no more than any of them, must be a mistake then, twos or something. But if it happen that from necessity, any of them will have traffic with us, or to us that is, isn't it? Or we with them, with cattle or any goods, that it is to be allowed in this wise, in this way, that hostages be given in pledge of peace, and as evidence whereby it may be known that the party has a clear back. Okay, so that's a kind of short document. Any ideas what it's going on about here, apart from the boundary bit? What are they concerned with? What are the things which the kings, Alfred and Guthrum, are concerned with establishing? They've said there's going to be a kind of boundary between us, between the English and the Danes, the Vikings. What else are they concerned with? Anyone got anything? The last part is interesting because it seems to be dealing with moving between the two areas. Okay, if it happened that from necessity any of them, the Danes, will have traffic with us or we with them, blah blah blah. Okay, so if you need to come into one land, cross the border, and go into the other, it has to be done this way. Okay, hostages be given in pledge of peace. Hostage here, what does this imply? Not quite hostage in the modern sense. Not captive, it's someone who's willingly given up. For example, I want to come into your land, and obviously you're not too happy with one of these other people, the English, for example, coming into your land. So to guarantee my good behavior, I might have to give one of my friends or whatever, okay, in that sense. Over to you, or vice versa. So hostages were not someone who were captured, but were someone who were to some extent a valuable person given up, so that if I do anything bad, you've got my man, or vice versa in that sense. Okay, a kind of guarantee. It's one way of guaranteeing things. In a period when there was not so much coinage and money around, okay, human life was in fact more important. Okay, given in pledge of peace, okay, as a promise to peace and so on. So they're trying to kind of control movement and relations across this new border and so on, okay, and guarantee that there won't be any further fighting. There was some more trouble, that's why they have the second peace treaty, but this is important here, okay. And here they're dealing with payment for murder and things like that on either side and things like this. So the King's Thane are the Anglo-Saxons, and then we talk about the Danish freedmen and things like that. So they're regulating behavior between the two sides. They're trying to set up some kind of status quo to protect social relations and things like that and guarantee peace. So during the course of the late 780s and 880s, we have these series of peace agreements and the creation of this border between the two regions, okay? And the northern region up here we tend to call the Danelaw, because that's where the law of the Danish people will continue, whereas south and west, as we've said before, we have the area ruled by Alfred himself. Alfred was also important, not just as a political or military leader. He also, during his reign, ushered in a kind of renaissance, okay, in England. He provided a context for a revival of the study of religious matters, but also the use of English. For example, for the rest of the Anglo-Saxon period, the standard form of their language, Old English, was the West Saxon dialect. He imposed that, and they translate books and they write new works. It's probably around this time that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle starts to be created as part of their kind of official history and so on. And he's presented as an English Charlemagne in some sources. Okay, he's kind of modelled vaguely on Charlemagne, who a little bit earlier in France had created a fairly large empire and had also had a kind of cultural revival and religious revival within that empire as well. So on a much smaller scale, Alfred the Great for the English, for the Anglo-Saxons, was both a political but also a sort of military, an important military figure, and in addition had this cultural revival going on and so on. So that's the first aspect, okay? We see defense and then consolidation of what you've got under Alfred, and then a building up of the basis of a new kind of kingdom and so on, based on the West Saxon traditions. Then, following his death, so beginning shortly after 900, okay, and down to the middle of the 10th century, we see a period of the gradual reassertion of English power northwards and eastwards, okay, by a series of stages, and we'll have a look at that now. So we'll go through the chronology, and if that's clear, we'll refer to this diagram as well, so we can see how the different kings were related. Edward was succeeded by his son, Alfred, was succeeded by his son Edward, known usually with the nickname the Elder, the Older. Okay. In addition, we should mention Alfred's daughter, various spellings of her name, the one I've got on the board there, and this one, okay, who was married to the Lord of Mercia, the little part of Mercia which was still kind of English. So during Edward's reign, we see the growing connection between the West Saxon kingdom and what remained English of Mercia. Okay, Mercia being the Midland region here. So we're talking West Saxon kind of heartland here, and this area of Western Mercia being under West Saxon influence but having its own ruler, but that ceases to happen. Under Edward, we see the beginning of attempts by the English to reassert their power. Edward plus his brother-in-law Athelred of Mercia and Athelfled, sister of Edward, as I said, they fight against the Northumbrians, the Vikings in Northumbria, that means, in 910, and they win the victory. The following year, Athelred dies, and then a few years later, his wife, who is West Saxon, of course, dies as well. And at that point, in 918 at the very latest, we can see Mercia is finally brought into the influence, direct influence of Wessex. So the kingdom is beginning to spread, still primarily within the English area at that point. 920, we see one of these series of what we call submissions. This case by the Northumbrian Vikings, the Scots and Strathclyde to Edward. This is another thing that's worth mentioning. On this diagram and at other times, the West Saxon or English kings, as we can begin to call them, periodically not only conquer new territory and make it part of their power, bless you, but they also claim to be the overlords over other people. So I don't know, if I am Edward, okay, and I'm trying to, and I now have Mercia under my power, okay, directly, I'm also saying to the Scots that although I don't control their kingdom, but somehow they have to recognize that I'm a bit more powerful than them, that I'm their overlord and things. So it's not direct political influence, but it's some kind of submission, recognition of authority, of greater authority. And Edward and the following kings organize a number of these submissions, and we'll look at one in a bit more detail if we've got time later. Following Edward's death, he is succeeded by his son Athelstan. There is like a, is he on this map? There was another member of the family who ruled for like 1 month or so, but ultimately power shifts from Edward to Athelstan, I should say. Athelstan is important for a number of things. He was quite a powerful ruler. He also received the submission of the Northumbrian Scots, of Strathclyde, the British kingdom in Strathclyde, and the Welsh. That's a mistake here. It shouldn't be Edward, it should be Athelstan at Yarmont. Okay, so again, he was asserting his ultimate power over the others. 10 years later, however, the Vikings at York, the Northumbrians, and the Scots unite to try and attack Athelstan, to try and undermine his position. And at a place that historians are still not sure where it was, somewhere in the north, at a place in the text called Brunanburh, he succeeded in defeating them in a very significant way, okay, and asserting his power in the north. So it's the beginning stage of the kind of crumbling of the Northumbrian power, okay, it has a few decades left. So he defeats this alliance against him. He is then succeeded by his half-brother, different wife of Edward the Elder, you see, Edmund I. And during his time, we see a number of changes and shifts. The power that Athelstan had established over the north breaks down, and the Scandinavians are back in York. Then Edmund begins to take a rather more immediate concern. So instead of attacking right up to York, instead of going right up to here, he conquers what are known as the 5 boroughs, these towns, Viking towns in this area here, immediately on the border, closer to his land in a sense. And then moves beyond that into Northumbria. So there's a slight break of power, then again he reasserts his power in Northumbria. When Edmund dies, his full brother, so another half-brother Athelstan, succeeds as King of England, King of the English, Eadred, okay? And again Northumbria submits to his power early in his reign. Then the famous Viking leader Eric Bloodaxe, which is a great surname, nickname to have, becomes established at York, okay? And Eadred invades and is able to expel Eric for a time. Then the Northumbrians decide that maybe they're not so happy with English power, so they revolt, and then they establish another Viking who also had some interest in Dublin, Olaf Sitrickson, and then Eric the Bloodaxe. Eric Bloodaxe is back in again. And finally, in 954, the Northumbrians remove Eric and accept Eadred, and 954 is traditionally the point when we say, okay, now Northumbria has passed, the Viking kingdom of Northumbria, whatever it is, has passed into English hands. We get some Viking leaders emerging, and we get attempts in the 11th century by Scandinavian kings to establish power in England, but that's a rather different situation. We'll talk about those in the next few weeks. But the situation created during the 9th century with the crumbling of the English power is now gone, and we get a situation, let me find the other map, it should be here. So the Kingdom of England by the end of the 10th century looks like this, okay? This is Wales, separate of course, and up here we have the remains of Strathclyde in Scotland, but this regions here are all ruled by the English kings, the descendants of Alfred the Great. In this region, the old Danelaw still exists, and lots of people of Scandinavian origin still live there, speaking for a long time yet a form of Old Norse, and having rather different lifestyle. So the kings are now ruling a kingdom which is not purely English, not purely Anglo-Saxon, and they have to set up different laws. They have to recognize the Danelaw is somehow different, and they have laws which regulate slightly differently what goes on here and somewhat differently what goes on in the north, for example. But technically, it's all now part of the English kingdom and so on. So this is the process of the creation of England as we know it. Let's just finish the chronology off by looking at a few of the other rulers and so on. Okay. So we've got up to Eadred here. He is succeeded by, it's spelled Edwy here, but we can call him Eadwig, who was the first of the sons of Edmund. The interesting thing is there are some political maneuverings going on after the death of Eadred, and although Edwig is technically king of the English, his younger brother Edgar is given a special title, King of the Mercians and Northumbrians. So you've got the proper bit of the kingdom in the south, and then his younger brother is given responsibility for Mercia and Northumbria. And obviously there was some either a concern for splitting the rule, or probably more likely this was power conflict between these two guys. Anyway, Eadwig dies shortly afterwards, and then Edgar is able to become fully king of the English, and he's perhaps one of the most famous ones of these later kings. And what we're going to look at now is what supposedly is meant to have happened in 973, and I'm hoping we can find the text of this here. Okay, beginning. Okay, we'll take it to there and move on. Okay, can you read that? Is that clear enough? Okay, this is taken from a text by a later medieval chronicler. Now we call him John of Worcester. It says Florence up there. That's an old way of describing it. Edward the Pacific, which means pacificus in Latin, peaceful, okay, King of England, being then in the 30th year of his age, received the benediction of the bishops of St. Dunstan and St. Oswald and all the other bishops of England, and was crowned and anointed as king with great pomp and ceremony in the city of, probably at Bath, in the first indiction. And then on the 5th of the Ides of May, which is the 11th of May apparently, being Whit Sunday, okay, shortly afterwards he sailed round the north coast of Britain with a large fleet and landed at Chester. So, Edgar is here at Bath, and he's been crowned king and anointed king. He's having his big ceremony to make out that he's a powerful guy, okay? And then he sails around England and Britain and reaches Chester. So presumably he sails down this coast. Remember, we talked about those Viking names down this coast of Wales because it's important for commerce. He sails, presumably sails all the way round and comes back down this way as a way of showing his power, sailing around Britain to assert his power, to remind people he was there. He was met, as he had given orders, by 8 tributary kings. Now I've got to jump forward now. Is there a next on this or not? No, I type in the page number. What's happened? I've lost my page. No, welcome to the free book. I don't want that. I want to... So much for my attempt at using the internet. Let me just try this again. Right. Now let's go 105. Okay, I've lost that text. Sorry? I was on 104 and I wanted to go to the next page. I couldn't see a thing saying next, so I typed in the next number, and now I've got something called the Age of the Clans for some reason. Maybe this is clickable. Let's see. Anything here that's clickable? You are reading. No, we're not reading that. We're reading something else. All right, let's try. Of course, this worked perfectly okay in my office, but never act with children, animals, and never teach with computers. Maybe that's the saying goes. Maybe I'll just press go. See that? Oh, there we go. Okay, he was met by these tributary kings. Remember, they were periodically making other kings submit to them. They weren't directly ruling over them, but they claimed this, okay? Namely, Kenneth, king of the Scots, Malcolm, king of the Cumbrians, that's Strathclyde, Maccus, king of several isles, and 5 others, named Dufnel, Seaforth, Hual, Jacob, and Ukiel, who swore fealty and bound themselves to military service by land and sea. Attended by them, King Edward one day went on board a boat, and while they plied the oars, he stood at the helm and steered skillfully down the course of the River Dee, which is the river that runs through the city of Chester, followed by his whole retinue of earls and nobles, pursued the voyage from the palace to the monastery of St. John the Baptist. And then, blah, 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 it carries on and coming back and so on. Now, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is the most contemporary account of all this, if I can find that, which I can't. Okay, here we go. Refers to the thing at Bath, but makes no mention of these guys rowing him up and down the river. Okay, he says he went with his fleet to Chester, and there 6, not 8 kings came to him and made their submission and pledged themselves to be his fellow workers by land and sea, which is more or less up to here. And this bit here is extra in John of Worcester's account. Do you think this happened or not? Let's analyse this text together. We have just about 5-10 minutes. What do you think's going on here? Did this really happen? This is a later account. This is a few hundred years later. It's not in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, so it's been added in. And the names of these kings have been added in as well.
I mean, it's likely it could have happened because kings would do this. Other smaller kings would submit to a king, but if it was added
And the submission bit probably happened in some form or other. Whether it was exactly these people, because the names are later in the text as well. What about all this stuff? They've gone in a boat, and all the guys, the kings, they're kings, okay? Kings of Scotland, kings of Strathclyde. And he's telling them, sit in that boat and row, okay, like some ordinary oarsman. And I'm going to sit at the back of the boat and steer it along, okay, and make sure we go in the right direction, okay? Now, if I was a king, if I was some kind of Welsh king or whatever, or even Scottish king, unless, Edgar really did have power over me, I wouldn't want to be doing that. I mean, come on. So I personally very much suspect that this is a later edition. What we need to see is what's the symbolism? Why? Why did a later writer want to describe this rowing thing? What's the idea of this? Whether it's a legend that he's picked up from earlier or whether he's made it up himself or something, it's probably an addition. But why would someone do this? Okay, because... Right. Right, okay, yes. And it's an analogy of their relationship, because he's saying, okay, I'm not the ruler completely. You still have your kingdom. You still have power, but it's only power to push things along. But ultimately, symbolically, the one who steers things, who guides where we go and things like that, is probably me, okay? And if we had the Latin text, we might even be able to play on some of the words and what they mean and so on, things like that. A few years ago, I wrote an article about this, that's why I mentioned this here, and published it. And for some reason, though it's just this one little event that happened in 1 year, since then about 3 or 4 other articles have all been published, some agreeing, some disagreeing, their own opinions. So of all the events in kind of Anglo-Saxon or British history in the early Middle Ages, this one event seems to have attracted quite a lot of attention recently and so on. But it's interesting because not only does it help us to see what happened or didn't happen, it's also telling us how the chroniclers write. Okay? As historians, we need to say, we don't just accept this at face value and then reproduce it in our history essays or history books. We have to be suspicious. When we get to this kind of level of detail and story, we have to be very quickly suspicious about what it means and what it represents and so on. Okay, let's just finish off our survey and we'll stick ourselves back onto, I didn't mention the Alfred jewel, didn't I? Our diagram. So we're here with Edgar, okay, who, more than any of the other kings, okay, is seeking to establish his position as overlord over the whole of Britain. He's the King of England, but he's also the overlord of the other kings, Welsh, Scottish, and Viking guys at that time, and so on. Edgar died shortly afterwards, okay, and was succeeded by his son, Edward the Martyr. There was some kind of succession struggle, some kind of conflict again between Edward and his brother, half-brother, Alfred, and within a few years, Edward was killed. Some people would suggest Alfred did it or organised it himself. It may have just been his supporters. One tradition suggests that it was Alfred's mother who organised the death of her stepson. But either way, we then get Alfred the Unready, as he's known, and I think on here, yes, I've got Undready there, Undready. Don't write down the D, okay, that's another typing mistake. We'll talk about Alfred because it's the background to the arrival of the Normans, so we'll be doing that next week or the week after, as it is now. The Old English word rad from which the modern unready doesn't quite mean the same as it does in modern English. So unready would mean, oh look, David's come to the class, he's brought a pen, but he didn't bring anything else, he's not really ready for the class. It's been not prepared. Rad means someone who's got knowledge and has received advice. Okay, so it's someone who it means here unready means someone who's not really well organized and knowledgeable about something, not quite prepared in that sense, because Athelred's reign saw a number of ups and downs, politically speaking, okay, which culminates in Scandinavians coming to power and so on. So he was badly advised and badly organized rather than not quite ready for something. And we'll follow up that story later on. So, from Alfred, round about 900, establishing his kingdom against the Vikings and establishing his cultural revival, we see in his successors, down to Edgar in particular, we see the process of spreading English power and then even asserting the authority of the English kings beyond what was their boundary and saying we are the overlords of the other British kings as well. So a significant kind of change of fortune. In Alfred's reign, it almost looked like Anglo-Saxon England was going to come to an end. By the time of Edgar in particular, okay, the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of the English of England was the most powerful and important political force in Britain. So in the process of less than 100 years, we see a complete change of what was going on. And that's, as I said, what we have on this last map here. Okay, we have political unity up to a point and so on. Okay, any questions? Okay, let's have a break then, and then we shall look at perhaps what's going on in Scotland and Ireland, but first we will discuss those Welsh genealogies which I gave out. So if any of you, I've got 1 or 2 spare copies, I think. If any of you don't have a copy, or if you've left yours behind, I don't know. Burchin and Zainab, you weren't here, so you don't have. You've got 10 minutes in which to read these quickly. Altai, you weren't here either, were you?